Back when I was in college, my roommates and I worked at the local event center on weekends. Our shifts ran from 8 p.m. to 3 a.m., and we were responsible for setting up and cleaning up for the various events held there. It was usually a group of 10 to 15 people, but even with so many of us working, the place always felt eerily empty when the lights were low and the crowds had gone home. There were always whispers about the center being haunted, but I never paid them much attention until things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One of my roommates, Josh, was a shift supervisor. That meant he had the unpleasant job of walking through the center after everyone else had left, ensuring all the doors were locked and secure. He was usually the last one to leave, and on one particular night, after we'd finished setting up for a basketball game the following day, Josh was doing his rounds. He made his way through the dark hallways, checking rooms and locking doors. As he reached the gym, he decided to shoot a few basketballs, a way to kill time before heading out. As the sound of his ball bouncing echoed through the empty gym, he suddenly heard a voice call out, "Hello." It came from the gangplank above the basketball court. Josh froze, his heartbeat quickening. He looked up and saw a figure standing there, a person peering down at him. The strange thing? The person wasn't dressed in the event center's uniform like we all were. It was 3:15 a.m. No one should have been there. Josh called up to the figure, demanding to know who they were and what they were doing in the building. The person only smiled, a wide, unsettling grin, before stepping back into the shadows and disappearing. Josh bolted from the gym, his mind racing. He had already checked that area earlier, ensuring the gangplank door was locked and the walkway was narrow. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. In his rush to leave, he locked the front door and got out of there, shaking. He didn't stop to question what he'd seen. He just needed to be far away from the place. I, on the other hand, spent most of my time cleaning the locker rooms, which were located right by the arena floor. They were isolated from the rest of the center, tucked away in the back where the only company I had was the occasional echo of my footsteps. Sometimes the temperature would drop dramatically in certain areas, and I'd find myself shivering in spots that should have been warm. Then there were the voices. At first, I thought I was imagining it, faint whispers, soft laughter coming from the showers, though every time I checked, there was no one there. It was a constant feeling of being watched, even though I was completely alone. My skin would crawl, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up for no reason. When this happened, I'd rush through my work and get out of there as fast as I could. But the strangest experience happened one night when I had to use the restroom before I left. It was the dead of night, just before closing, and I went into the main restroom near the office. As a habit, I checked the stalls to make sure I was alone. I wasn't paranoid, but it had become routine by then, especially given the strange occurrences around the center. I went about my business, the cold tile beneath me making everything feel even more isolated. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of the toilet next to mine flushing. The faucet turned on and off by itself, and then the lights flickered. Then, nothing. The entire restroom plunged into pitch darkness. I froze, my heart racing. I had no way of seeing anything. This was before the days of smartphones with flashlights, and I had no way of figuring out what was going on. My first thought was that one of my coworkers was messing with me, but when I finished, I rushed out of the stall, heart pounding. I turned on the lights, only to find no one. The restroom was completely empty. The lights were on, the faucets silent, and the air felt unnaturally still. I checked the rest of the building, and no one was there. Everyone else had already gathered in the office to clock out. I asked the crew the next day if anyone had been in the restroom, but everyone had been accounted for, and no one had been on my floor. The feeling of being alone in that empty restroom still haunts me to this day, as I'm left wondering what it was that I felt, or who it was that had been with me. There was something about that place, something that never quite felt right. I don't know if it was the building itself or something that had lingered long after the crowds had gone home, but I could never shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones there in the dead of night. I worked the graveyard shift at a medical facility for a while, And during that time, I encountered some experiences that have stayed with me ever since. It was a time when the lines between the living and the dead seemed thinner, and sometimes it felt like the very walls of the building were holding secrets, secrets that didn't want to be uncovered. There was one patient, an elderly woman who had been with us for months. She was sweet, but she had a strange habit that no one could explain. Every night, without fail, she would call out. Sometimes it was just a whisper, other times a loud, desperate cry, but her words were always the same. Who will die next? It was always the same phrasing, like a chant, as if she could see something no one else could. The first time she said it, I thought it was just the ramblings of an old woman. But then things started happening. No matter what we did, who we called in, or what precautions we took, patients she named would pass away, always after she called their names. It didn't matter if they were stable, if they had recovered, or if they were under the best care. Every time she said a name, that person would die. We put staff on high alert every time she spoke those words, but it was never enough. She would just call out again, and another life would be lost. I'd grown close to her in the weeks I'd been working there, sitting with her, talking with her when no one else had the time. She became almost like a strange, haunted friend. And then one night, it happened to her. After weeks of calling out the names of others, she whispered her own name. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe this time, just this once, things would be different. But she passed away that night. She was my friend, and yet she was taken, just like everyone else she had named. I don't know what it was about her, whether she had some kind of gift or curse, but it was unsettling to witness. And to this day, I still can't shake the feeling that her passing wasn't just an unfortunate event. It felt like something orchestrated, something predestined. Another time, there was a patient with schizophrenia who had been admitted to the facility. She was in for a long-term stay, and during the night shifts, I would check on her room, as I did with all the patients. But when I went in there, things felt off. It wasn't the usual calm of the night, the soft beeping of the machines, the distant hum of the air conditioning. No, it felt like something was waiting, something watching. One night, as I stepped into her room, I saw it. A dark, shapeless shadow standing in the corner of the room near the window. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a reflection. It was just a shadow, darker than the night itself, and its eyes were glowing red. I couldn't move. The air was thick, like the weight of it pressed against my chest. I tried to turn around, but before I could, I felt something, a force, an unseen hand, slam into me. I staggered back, but no one else was there. No one had heard it. No one could explain it. Each time I went in there after that, it was the same. The shadow would be there, and I would hear growling from somewhere in the darkness. I wasn't imagining it. There was something in that room, something that didn't belong. I would leave the room in a rush, my heart pounding, my legs shaking, and I swear I could still hear that growl echoing in my ears even after I'd left the building. It wasn't just the shadow that disturbed me. It was the feeling, the growing sense of dread that would accompany me every time I stepped into that room. It was like the place was closing in on me, suffocating me with each passing minute. I came close to quitting. The fear was so overwhelming, and the strange incidents seemed to escalate. I felt like I was being pulled into something dark, something I wasn't supposed to understand. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in that room, but I know this: something evil was there. And when I left, it stayed behind. I've never worked graveyard shifts again, and I never want to. Because sometimes the things that haunt a place aren't just whispers in the dark, they're the shadows that linger, waiting for someone to see them. I work in senior care, and part of my job involves staying with clients who require 24/7 care. This means that someone is always on duty, even through the dead of night, from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m. During these hours, it's a lonely and quiet job, especially when you're working in the homes of elderly clients who often live alone or have lost their loved ones. One night, I was working a shift with a client who lived in a 2-story ranch house. It was a comfortable home, well kept, and for the most part, peaceful, except for the occasional unsettling moment. The client was in his late 80s, and his wife had passed away a few years earlier. We had set up baby monitors in his room, placed on both floors so I could hear if he needed anything while I was downstairs, attending to the rest of the house. That night, I was trying to get him settled for bed and decided to take a few moments to tidy up in the kitchen before heading back upstairs. As I walked through the house, I heard the usual crackle from the baby monitor. It wasn't unusual for it to make a sound, sometimes static from interference or just picking up the house settling. But then something strange happened. I heard a voice. At first, I thought it might have been him talking to himself, maybe muttering in his sleep. But no, it was a woman's voice, gentle and soothing, responding to him. There was no one else in the house. No one at all. I froze in place. My heart started to race, and my mind began to race with 1,000 thoughts. Was someone else here? Could it be a mistake with the monitor? But no, it sounded too clear, too real. The woman's voice was calm, as though she knew exactly who she was speaking to. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and went back upstairs to check on my client. As I entered his room, he looked at me, completely unaware of the strange conversation that had just taken place over the monitor. He seemed peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The thing is, I knew his wife had passed away a few years before. From the stories he had told me, she had been a lovely woman, caring, warm, and always by his side. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny what I had heard. I was certain that his wife was still with him, even if only in some way that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was her spirit visiting him during those quiet, lonely hours of the night, comforting him when no one else was there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I went about my duties. Every now and then, I would hear the soft crackling of the monitor, as if something or someone was listening on the other end. I would glance up at the room, half expecting to see her standing there, just out of view, waiting for her husband to call out to her again. I don't know if it was the stress of the shift or the haunting thought that I wasn't alone, but I kept hearing her voice, even after I left the room. Her gentle words would echo in my mind long after I turned off the monitor. It was unsettling, but it was also oddly comforting. After all, if she was watching over him, then maybe he wasn't as alone as I had thought. I don't know how many times this happened, her voice answering his late-night musings or soft words of reassurance. It didn't always happen, but when it did, I couldn't deny the chill that ran down my spine. Sometimes I would sit there, alone in the house, and just listen, half expecting to hear her voice again, reassuring him that she was still there, still taking care of him, even after all this time. It's one of those things that, no matter how much I try to explain it away, I can't. There are some things in this world that don't make sense, but sometimes they happen anyway. And sometimes I wonder if the things we think are gone are actually still with us in some form or another. But I'll tell you this. It's the last thing you want to hear at 1 a.m. when you're alone in a dark house, standing in the kitchen, just trying to get through your shift. I've always prided myself on not being easily scared, not by spirits, not by anything supernatural. I've worked with the paranormal enough to have a healthy respect for it, but it's never made me run for the hills. That is, until one experience I'll never forget, one that still makes me laugh and shudder every time I think back on it. It happened in New Brighton on the Wirral, a place that's rich with history and, depending on who you ask, haunted. The area's got its fair share of ghost stories, but there's one spot that always gets my attention: the smugglers' tunnels. These tunnels, hidden beneath the town, were once used by smugglers to move goods in secret, and now they're a popular location for those with a taste for the paranormal. I was leading a small group of guests through the tunnels, showing them what the area had to offer, hoping to give them a real taste of what it's like to be in a place where the air is thick with history and, if you believe the stories, spirits. The night had a weird energy to it. The guests were excited, buzzing with anticipation. I'd been down there so many times before that I was comfortable. Too comfortable, I suppose. But as we made our way deeper into the tunnels, something felt off. The air grew colder, the sound of footsteps echoing against the stone walls, and then, without warning, something happened that still gets my heart racing. A face. It appeared out of nowhere, rushing at us from the darkness. I can still see it in my mind. Pale, gaunt, its eyes wide and intense, its mouth open as if it was screaming, but it wasn't screaming. It was like it was coming right at us. Before anyone could even process what was happening, the group bolted. They panicked and ran, scrambling for the exit. I couldn't blame them. I froze for a moment, caught off guard, but they didn't give me time to react. I was left alone in the pitch black of the tunnel, the flickering light of their torches disappearing into the distance. For a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. I could hear nothing but my own breath and the distant echoes of my guests running away. The tunnel felt like it was closing in around me. But then, the strange thing happened. I didn't panic. Instead, I had to rely on my senses and something deeper within me, my spirit guide. I've always believed in them, and that night, it was like I could feel them guiding me, helping me navigate the dark, winding tunnel back to my group. I remember feeling the cool stone under my fingers as I slowly made my way through the dark. The tunnel seemed endless, like it was shifting around me, but I knew I had to trust in what I couldn't see. My spirit guide was there, their presence as clear to me as if they were right beside me. I took slow, measured steps, following the sense of calm they brought me, until finally I heard voices, faint at first, then clearer. The group had stopped, thinking they'd lost me. They were in a panic, not realizing I was already on my way back. When I finally emerged from the darkness and rejoined them, they looked at me like I was some kind of ghost myself, pale and wide-eyed, still trying to catch my breath. I couldn't help but laugh, though. I'd made it through the tunnels, and they hadn't even realized it. We all stood there in the flickering light, the panic from moments before giving way to nervous laughter. I still laugh about it now, but there's a part of me that will never forget how close I came to losing myself in those tunnels. And the face, oh, that face, will always be a part of the memory. It's one of those things you can't explain, but you can't shake either. It's not something that scared me, but it's definitely something that made me rethink my connection to the world beyond. Now, when I lead tours through those tunnels, I can't help but wonder, what else is lurking in the dark, and how much of the experience is guided by the living, and how much is by those who came before us? It was a quiet night, one of those long shifts working security at an auto auction lot. The kind of night where time seems to stretch on forever, and every creak of the building or shift in the shadows makes you wonder if you're losing your mind. I was sitting in the small guard shack, staring at the security monitors, keeping an eye on the cameras that covered every inch of the property. The lot was quiet. The auction had ended hours ago, and all the cars were locked up tight, sitting under the flickering glow of the streetlights. My job was simple: make sure everything stayed secure, monitor the cameras, and make rounds every hour. But that night something happened that I still can't explain. I saw it on the camera first. A set of headlights, far off in the distance, coming up the quarter-mile driveway. The glow from the lights cut through the dark, the beams slowly growing larger as the car drew closer. I watched the headlights for a while, wondering who would be driving up this late, but I didn't hear any engine noise, no tires crunching against gravel, just the headlights moving steadily towards me. The longer I watched, the more confused I became. There shouldn't have been anyone here. I was alone on the lot, and we had no scheduled pickups or deliveries at that hour. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had gotten lost, maybe a late-night visitor had come by without calling. But no, I knew that wasn't the case. The headlights were too deliberate, too steady. As the lights got closer, I stood up from the shack, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside to greet whoever it was. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I made my way to the front of the shack, shining my flashlight toward the approaching headlights. I stood there waiting for the car to pull up to see who had arrived. But as I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the car's shape, the headlights simply vanished. There was nothing there. No car, no sound, nothing but the stillness of the empty driveway. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to wrap my mind around what I had just seen. I had watched those headlights the entire way up, following them on the monitor, expecting them to reach the shack and stop. But when I stepped outside, it was as if the car had never existed. There was no trace of it, no tire marks in the gravel, no engine idling in the distance. It was as if the car had simply driven into the thin air and disappeared. My heart began to race, and I felt that familiar chill of unease crawl up my spine. I didn't know what to think. Was it a glitch in the cameras? Some trick of the light? But no, I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't normal. I stood outside for a few more minutes, scanning the darkness, but the driveway was empty, just like the rest of the lot. I went back into the guard shack, keeping a wary eye on the cameras, but no more headlights appeared that night. Later, when my shift ended, I told a fellow security guard about what had happened, half expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me, his face serious, and said, "You're not the first one to see something like that around here." That's when he told me about the rumors, about a car that had supposedly crashed on the property years ago, late at night, with no one ever finding the driver. Some said the driver had died, others said they vanished without a trace. But the stories all had one thing in common: headlights, drifting up the long driveway, only to disappear right before reaching the shack. I never saw those headlights again. But every time I worked that shift after, I couldn't help but keep an eye on the cameras, waiting for something to come down that long, empty road. And every time I looked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one watching. I used to work in construction, and for the most part, it was just another job. But there was one project that changed everything. I was part of a crew assigned to work on an old building that had been gutted by a fire. It was a former train depot, a sprawling structure that had once housed offices, a microbrewery, and several restaurants. The fire had left it a shell of its former self, and our job was to shore up the walls, install a second floor, relocate the elevator, beef up the foundation, and build a new roof system. One day, my fellow worker Dan and I were tasked with relocating the elevator. The plan was to cut out the flooring and floor joists to frame up an opening in the center of the building. We worked tirelessly, sweating through the day, and by the time we finished the task, we were exhausted. As we cleaned up the area, I managed to drop my tape measure down into the hole. I knew I'd have to go into the basement to retrieve it. There were two staircases I could take to get down. One was a bit further away, but I decided to take the closest one. It was narrow, dark, and led to a small room with no light. My instincts told me something felt off, but I didn't think much of it. I'd been in that building countless times by now. As I descended the stairs, I found myself standing in complete darkness until I reached the small room. It was cold and quiet, except for the faint sound of my boots echoing on the concrete. I felt around for a light switch, but there was nothing. After a moment, my eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from the room beyond. I could see the faint outline of my tape measure lying on the floor near the far wall. The dim light barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. But there on the floor was my tape measure, just as I'd left it. I started toward it. As I approached, something caught my eye. Just out of the light, I could make out a figure standing there. I thought it was Dan at first, but as I looked closer, something didn't feel right. His clothes were different, and the way he stood seemed odd, like he wasn't moving the way a person should. I could only make out the vague outline of his feet and legs, but it didn't take long for the realization to hit me. Dan hadn't come down this way. I had been the one to take the stairs, and the figure I was looking at wasn't him. I called out, "Dan? How did you get down here so fast?" There was no response, just silence. I took another step, my heart pounding now, my breath quickening. When I turned to look at him again, the figure was gone. He vanished into thin air as if he had never been there in the first place. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a cold sweat trickle down my spine. I grabbed the tape measure as fast as I could, and without thinking twice, I ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. The weight in my chest grew heavier with each step, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. When I got back to the crew, I was shaking. I told them what had happened, but they just laughed it off, calling me Ghostbuster. They even shortened it to Buster as a nickname, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had seen something in that room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Over the next few weeks, word of my experience spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before a local TV station, 100 miles away, called to interview me about the incident. A documentary filmmaker even reached out, wanting to include my story in a project he was working on. As strange as it was, the attention only confirmed what I already knew. There was something in that building. I started to dig into the history of the train depot, and that's when I uncovered a chilling story. The original owner of the building, back in the 1800s, had a daughter who had fallen in love with a local man. But the father didn't approve. The man wasn't of their social class, and after a violent argument, the father shot and killed him. The story went that the girl never recovered from the loss, and it was said that her spirit, as well as her lover's, still lingered in the building, waiting for the day they could be reunited. As the days went on, the strange occurrences continued. I was assigned the task of locking up and unlocking the building every day. Sometimes I'd arrive early in the morning to find the doors unlocked, and there wouldn't be a single footprint in the snow outside. I would stand there in the eerie silence, wondering who or what had been there before me. The place had a way of making you feel like you were never truly alone, even if you couldn't see anyone. That building gave me the creeps, but I couldn't escape it. Every time I went there, it felt as if the past was breathing down my neck, its long dead memories pressing in around me. And every time I walked through those doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking in the footsteps of those who had come before me, ghosts still trapped in that place, waiting for something or someone to set them free. To this day, I can't quite explain what happened in that dark room with the figure, but I know what I saw, and I know that building held something far beyond the walls and the rubble we were trying to fix. Something that still lingers, even when the lights go out. I used to work as an animal facility technician at the University of New England, caring for rats and mice used in laboratory experiments. The facility was located in Stella Maris Hall, the oldest building on campus, situated in the basement level. The hall had an eerie history. What was once the morgue for St. Francis College, complete with an old freezer, drains in the floors, and foot pedal washing basins still intact, all remnants of its somber past. The building's history felt oppressive, especially when you considered the sub-basement where we worked once a week, deep beneath the rest of the campus. There were rumors that the building was haunted, of course. Some people claimed they had experienced strange occurrences, but my boss, who had worked there for years, always shrugged it off. Even the older girl who had been working there for a few years hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. For a while, my best friend and I didn't experience anything strange, so we dismissed the rumors as mere campus folklore. That all changed one night when we had to clean the cages in the sub-basement. The animals in that room were on a reverse light cycle, which meant they were kept under a single red light during the day. At night, the normal overhead lights would come on, making it easier to clean. We were working in the dim glow of the lights, chatting casually, when we heard it, the unmistakable click of hard-soled shoes in the hallway. Thinking it was security, clearing the building before locking up, I ran up the 3 small steps to the hallway to let them know we were still working. But when I reached the hallway, it was empty. The doors to the labs were heavy, ID access only, and they closed slowly. The doors to the outside were noisy and creaky, and had anyone gone up the stairs, we would have heard them. Yet there was no one. The hallway was completely still. We finished cleaning up quickly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over us. How had we missed someone? We still couldn't explain it. From that point on, it was impossible to ignore the strange occurrences. If we worked in separate rooms, we would hear someone call our names, only to find that no one had spoken. We constantly felt like we were being watched, and it wasn't just the feeling. We heard whispers, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone we knew, and occasionally the unsettling sensation of being touched, hair pulled, or a tap on the shoulder. On some nights, the atmosphere grew even stranger. We would hear the sounds of children playing, voices echoing through the empty halls, and faint, haunting hymns or prayers being chanted. It was like the building was trying to communicate with us, but we had no way to understand it. One night, we decided to bring a recorder and ask some questions. As we sat in the silence, the atmosphere grew heavier, darker. We both suddenly became ill, overwhelmed with a feeling of dread that made it hard to breathe. Without saying a word, we grabbed the recorder and fled the building. Once outside, the sick feeling lifted and we felt better. But when we reviewed the recording later, we heard something we hadn't expected. I had asked, "Is there anyone here?" And in response, a voice, faint but clear, whispered, "I am." That was enough to convince us. Something was in that building, something that wasn't just a rumor or a trick of the mind. We decided to look into the history of Stella Maris Hall to understand what might be causing these strange experiences. The building had been constructed between 1740 and 1744 as the home of the Honorable Judge Rishworth Jordan and his family. The Jordan family occupied it for nearly a century before it was purchased by the Sisters of Presentation of Mary and turned into an orphanage. In the 1930s, it became a boarding school. Then, in 1962, the Franciscan monks took ownership, and it became the College of Medicine at St. Francis College. Today, it houses the College of Osteopathic Medicine at the University of New England. What struck me most, though, was discovering that Judge Jordan, his wife, and several of their descendants were buried across the street in what was once the Jordan family burial ground. Now, it was just the front lawn of someone's home. On the campus itself, the Old Town Burial Ground was located just nearby, its weathered 18th century headstones standing as silent witnesses to the passage of time. After learning all this, it was hard not to feel a chill every time we worked in the sub-basement. The ghosts of the past seemed to linger there, tied to the building, to its dark history. The whispers, the unexplained noises, the eerie feeling of being watched, they all seemed to stem from something far older than us. And when we asked, "Is anyone here?" the answer was clear: "I am." The building, it seemed, was not just haunted by the past, the people who had once lived and worked there. It was haunted by the very history of the land itself. Thanks for reading, and I hope you can feel the same chill I felt walking those halls late at night. Because once you know the history of a place like Stella Maris Hall, you'll never walk through its doors the same way again.